Paul, before we talk about the story, I want to talk about the period, about what was happening in 1950, post-war, pre-ready-to-wear designer fashion. Why is this period so good for this kind of story?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, John. um, well, um, just after the war, there were two places where fashion was going strong. Paris and London. But Paris was really excelling because a lot of the designers had kind of laid low, and right after the war, they were able to kind of emerge immediately and come up with some pretty great stuff. Obviously, the list is long. The stuff, the dresses that we all kind of know. If you've ever seen a picture of a great dress in history, it's the Dior, Balenciaga, going further into Givenchy and stuff like that. But those were great designers, but the people that made the dresses were there. They were available to them. In London, there was a little bit of a stutter start after the war. I mean, rationing was still there, even though maybe the designers weren't beholden to that kind of stuff, that they were really trying to, the government was always trying to sort of push to sort of make certain wools and fabrics and stuff like that so that they could kind of get a foothold back into the industry. And that's where our guy is. And we decided to set our story in 55, which was just after rationing, and just sort of far enough away from the war that you could kind of have the hangover of it a little bit still, but not have to really address it too much, because our story was occupied with something else.
Do you start thinking about this romance from the very beginning and then it becomes a fashion designer, or do they become one and the same very early on?
No, that's the order. It was a love story and a relationship movie first. And the nature of their relationship was obvious to me, that it was a man of great fussiness, singular and kind of self-obsessed and possessed, and that what would happen when his life is sort of interrupted by love in a way that kind of that makes for a good dramatic story. So we were in search of a job for this character, and all signs started pointing towards making it a fashion designer, because it could give us some good, good costumes, good production value.
So Mark, you have worked with Paul on pretty much everything he's ever done, correct? This seems like an assignment that is both gratifying and terrifying, because were it a composer, he is asking you to write a symphony, and this character is going to be a great musician. As a designer, you're going to have to come up with a wardrobe and designs that justify his renown. So what is your starting point for the work that this character is going to do? Where do you start deciding what his style is going to be?
You know, I think at first I came over and looked at the things that you'd been looking at and kind of what captured your imagination. And luckily I had a script to work with too, and figured out what the major sort of beat gowns or outfits would be. And then, he's got things that he's interested in, and I'll go away and do some more research and come back and say, well, how about this? Or how about if we approach this a certain way? And then put that together in a visual book, and yes, no, maybe. And then I think we took it to Daniel to look at as well in New York at that point, right?
We realized pretty early on that it wouldn't be the traditional thing where Mark and I might be collaborating on the costumes, that there was a triangle, that we have Daniel playing a costume designer. He's going to have something to say about it, right? So it was a kind of, so we had to kind of find a way for the three of us to work, which actually ended up being really easy. But it was just, you look at all these dresses and the inspirations, and the inspirations might have been initially like a Balenciaga, but that was very sculpted stuff. Charles James, really sculpted stuff. And the one thing I remember us saying early on was like, right, we're not making a movie about the world's greatest fashion designer, because we wanted it to be very, very English. And what does that mean? So that means tweeds, and that means sort of the creative inspirations that are coming out of this man. And Daniel could sort of start to fill in those inspirations, and Mark would sort of then interpret them and bring them to life. So
at what point do you decide it's not going to be chic?
Fuck chic. I mean, chic,
I know, but
it's
an important point in the story. And how would you define that in your conversations? How do you define fuck chic? What is that not going to be in terms of what he is not going to do as a designer?
we weren't allowed to say the word chic, so we didn't really.
But it's also, it's, you know, I love the idea that sort of films kind of unfold. You know, every decision influences the next decision, kind of. And I thought that we went on this weird road of looking at inspiration and then seeing what we had, or finding a new garment or something to be inspired by, and then including Daniel in on the conversation, and look at this fabric and what did he think of things. And so it really, there's no seed of any one garment. It's a lot of interesting influence.
But I think the other thing that started to happen is that you can have all of these ideas, and maybe you're pulling inspiration from historical. That's one thing. And then it starts to get even more, because maybe you're thinking about stealing or combining two different dresses that you've seen historically. When it starts to get more interesting is when we sort of had an atelier to build these costumes, and you're actually then making up ideas based on these fabrics or laces. And then to take it a step further, it became even more interesting when the casting has happened, because then you're also shaping ideas to the women who are going to wear these dresses, because the dresses were great, but when they're laying on the floor, there's just like a pile of fabric. But when it's on somebody, it's really becomes a dress. And so once we had Vicky and there was her shape, everything just comes out of like, oh, this is a great dress, or that's historical, or whatever it was, and it starts to become slowly its own creation, which is really, that's when it really started to get really fun.
Where did you find Vicky, and what did you need for your actor to play Alma?
We found her in a tea shop in the north of London. No, we found her. Daniel and I fantasized about what we wanted, and what we wanted was somebody, a European, sort of Eastern European, perhaps, somewhere from over there, certainly an immigrant to England at that time. I started keeping my eyes open, and I saw a movie that Vicky made called The Chambermaid, which I really enjoyed. And then in the traditional way of casting, Cassandra Kulakundas, our casting director, asked sort of women between a certain age and a certain background to audition. And then very early on, a tape came in that was Vicky's, and it was like, you know, classic case of stop looking, stop looking. She seemed to be so perfect. And I don't think we realized just how perfect it was. She was perfect in the way that she looked, in the way that these words came out of her, in a kind of determination. And she's here, so I shouldn't say a lot of them.
It's okay.
But, and then to meet her was kind of further proof that she's just as strong-willed, determined, bossy, and all the rest as Alma. So
And that probably comes in handy when you're acting opposite somebody like Daniel, who's going to be very forceful in his performance. There's maybe a better word for it, but would you describe what it was like acting opposite Daniel, and how much of Alma was part of you acting opposite this very strong-willed actor?
It was a challenge to work with him, of course, and I think it's really difficult for me to give the right answer, because I was only trying to react, because obviously he was preparing so well and such a long time, and I didn't prepare. I prepared a little bit on my side, but I couldn't rehearse or anything, and so I decided to take it from the place that was left for me, which was no place, you know what I mean? So I tried to be open and completely not really know what I'm doing, to rely on my instinct. And that's what I did. So I don't really know how it was to work with him, because I was with Reynolds the whole time. It was always Reynolds, and I was just trying to react there.
When you come on, Dylan, how far into the process is the film, and at what point are you starting to hear Johnny's music as well?
Paul and I talk and hang out before shooting, but when shooting starts, I start and looking at stuff and talking to Paul and kind of putting things together and making sure everybody has what they need. So I was in London for the shoot. Johnny's. When I walked in, I think we had 20 cues that Paul's go, oh, Johnny did a new thing I got this morning, and he'll just send it, and it's incredibly inspiring because Johnny watches dailies too. We give him sets of dailies as we go, but I think it's late in the process when he starts to sort of compose to picture, if he ever does. It's more from talking to Paul, from knowing the script, and from feeling. And I think he does stuff bouncing off Paul that we end up with a whole treasure trove of stuff that, immediately several genius things pop to the top and, whoa, this is great, this is great. The kind of theme for the movie, the riddle piano thing, came early on in its initial form. And I love that way of working with music, actually, that it doesn't get sort of nailed to picture, that it's a song, that it's a feeling from the composer, like a performance from an actor, like words from the writer. You've got this other thing that, sometimes it knows where it wants to go, but other times we're just trying it out. Let's try this here, let's try that there. And it's a great malleable back and forth where notes go to him and cues come back and we just bat it back and forth.
I want to talk about some specifics about the design. The seamstresses who are building some of these clothes look like, to me, real seamstresses. Did you actually cast people who had built clothes and knew the way in which that style of clothing would have been made by hand?
Yeah, that's right. It's a combination. Nana and Biddy, if you remember the two older women, we met them at the V&A. They're volunteers there, but they worked for Hardy Amy's 60s, maybe 60s, 50s, late 50s, 60s. And they were super helpful and then so charismatic that we also gave them sizable roles. And then all the background is a combination of actresses with sewing experience. Mm-hmm. You have like resumes, and at the bottom it's like horseback riding, like sewing. And so it was, we had them, and but in the foreground were a real set of hands who were actually some of the sewers who made the actual costumes. I mean,
So they're building costumes on camera.
Worse than that, they're building costumes the night before until like 5 o'clock in the morning, finishing it, coming to the set at 8 with no sleep, and then being asked to do it again for the camera, rip it apart, and do it again for the camera. So that's why they look so tired.
Thank you for bringing us your film.
Thank you, John.